This is the web transmission service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. Our annual Member and Son Night took place on November the 2nd. Our guest speaker was Major Tyler Wentzell, Canadian historian and veteran of both the regular and reserve forces.
We'll get the full impact here.
I thought I was robust enough at the other end. Unaccustomed as I am to public speaking. Grandsons, sons, nephews, all of you who might be here tonight, you may recall Mark Twain's reflection. When I was a boy of 14, my father was so ignorant that I could hardly stand to have the old man around. But when I got to be 21, I was astonished at how much the old man had learned in 7 years. The relationship between fathers and sons is somewhat symbiotic, I think. Good fathers make good sons, and he who can be a good son will be a good father. And I realized that when my own son once said to me, what son would not want to have a beer with his dad? That we become friends, not just father and son. Gentlemen, please raise a glass and a toast to our sons, grandsons, and nephews. Cheers.
Sons, grandsons, and nephews.
Cheers, sir.
Thanks very much, David. Thank you very much, David. And now we come to the stimulating and entertaining part of the evening, courtesy of Major Tyler Wentzell. I should mention before I give him the introduction that I met an individual out at the bar, and I said, oh, who are you with? He said, oh, I'm just by myself. He says, but when I read the blurb on Tyler Wentzell, I thought, I think I'd like to hear what he's got to say. And so here he is, wherever he is in the crowd. Major Tyler Wentzell joined the Canadian Armed Forces in 2002 and attended the Royal Military College of Canada. Upon commissioning in 2006, he joined the 3rd Battalion of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry and served as an operational mentor and liaison team leader with an Afghan National Army Reconnaissance Company. In 2011, he transferred to the Army Reserve and continued his service with the 48th Highlanders of Canada, where he is now the Deputy Commanding Officer. He holds a law degree from the University of Toronto, a Master of Arts in War Studies from the Royal Military College of Canada, and is presently completing a doctoral degree in law from the University of Toronto. He publishes on matters of military history and defense studies, and his first book, Not for King or Country, Edward Cecil Smith, the Community Party and the Spanish Civil War, was published in 2020. He teaches at Canadian Forces College and the University in Toronto. What on earth else does he do? Who knows, but we'll hear tonight. Please welcome Major Tyler Wentzell as your speaker.
Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you all for having me here tonight. Members, sons, grandsons, nephews, members, and other honored guests. When I was invited to speak with you tonight, I initially assumed that it had something to do with my military history work, which is why I've spoken here in the past. And let me tell you that speaking about one's research is a lot less daunting than speaking about one's self. Nonetheless, I shall endeavor to do my best. Normally, I talk about people who are older, deader, and more interesting than I am, but this is what you've got. Tonight, I'm going to tell you a bit of my own story, and if I may, I would like to dedicate this to my own father, Curtis Wentzell, of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who has always provided me with the inspiration to try and be the best version of myself. When I was in grade 11, I decided that I wanted to go on a student exchange. For reasons I still can't explain, the school administration made it clear to me that I didn't have enough credits, it was impossible. But One approach would be you can do, and I assume they tell this to everyone, to just kill any enthusiasm. Like, well, you could do a special project of some kind. You're not going to do that because you're a lazy kid. But I decided I was going to do that. And I loved history. It was absolutely my favorite subject. So I immediately went to talk to my favorite high school teacher, Mr. Kevin Murphy. This man was a spectacular educator and he immediately talked to me like an adult, even though I definitely shouldn't have been given that kind of respect. And we talked about ideas of what we could do, how we could get there. And we landed on what seems like an absurd idea, but it changed the course of my life. I was going to interview veterans. I was going to do an oral history project to talk to veterans of the Second World War, listen to their stories, write them down, do my best version of a written product. Great. So we pitched the idea, it was accepted, and off to the races. And if I was successful, I could have my cake and eat it too. One problem though, I knew exactly one veteran, Merle Wentzell. Same family name, same small village in Nova Scotia, no relation. But this man was basically my adopted grandfather. I started with him. I was 17, and if I'm honest, I don't think I knew much about anything at all. And when I teach, I always tell my students that there is no such thing as a dumb question, but let me tell you that I really put that concept to the test. Because I definitely asked this brave, intelligent man a lot of dumb questions. But he was patient with me and kind, and he took the time to answer my questions. He explained to me the difference between simple things, like the difference between an officer and a non-commissioned officer, the difference between a tank and a self-propelled howitzer, the difference between the different battles that he was in, why he was there, what he did. He told me about his decision to join, the nature of artillery training, going ashore in Normandy, the battles, the occupation of Germany, and volunteering again to join the Canadian division that was meant to go fight the Japanese in the Pacific, which of course was never actually sent. He told me about being scared, about camaraderie and the pride he felt, not so much at the war's end, because at the war's end he was surrounded by desolation. But years later, decades later, when he got to go back to the Netherlands, when he got to meet the people that he helped liberate and their children and their children's children, and to visit the graves of his friends, and to see the attention that the Dutch people had showered upon those graves, fresh flowers and candies and candles that had been left there recently by a grateful people. This was my first interview, the first of almost 100 that I did. How did I find them? Well, one by one, people introduced me to their friends, and I would go to legions, and people would point me in different directions. And for the younger people in the crowd, there used to be this thing called a phone book. And if you got a name, you'd flip open the phone book and you'd find the number, and if you were brazen enough, you would just straight up cold call someone. And I was pretty brazen. I cold called Smokey Smith, the last living Canadian Victoria Cross winner. 17-year-old, hi, are you the Smokey Smith? Yes, he was, and not only did he have the courtesy to not hang up on me immediately, which is what I would have done in his situation, but we had an interview, a long one, and he told me about his life before the war, about his experiences in the lumber camps in British Columbia, his decision to join the army, and his experiences in Italy. He told me about the day he got his Victoria Cross on the Savio River, and this is a reasonably well-known story, but unless there's anyone not familiar with it, it cannot be told enough. In October 1944, Smokey Smith was part of a tank hunting team holding a bridgehead on the Savio River in northern Italy. The German army in both wars was relatively predictable in its use of rapid and punishing counterattacks. We took an inch, they tried to knock it back each and every time. And today was no exception. On this cold, rainy night, the Germans attacked with 3 Mark V Panther tanks supported by a platoon of infantry in half-tracks. Almost immediately, the other men in Smokey Smith's tank hunting team were killed or wounded, and he was almost immediately on his own. Using his rifle and the venerable Piat, the projectile infantry anti-tank, which, if you can imagine, is a spring-loaded anti-tank weapon. Spring-loaded basically being a nice way of saying you got to get up real close to take out a tank with this thing. He destroyed one tank almost immediately and made short work of the infantry as they tried to dismount from their half-track. He did not describe these events in terms of his own heroics. I think at this stage of his life he was sick of being told he was a hero. Asterisk, he obviously is a hero. He told me that what he had done on that day was exactly what he had been trained to do. He used cover, he changed position, he had confidence in his ability to use the weapon systems at his disposal, and he made sure that every shot counted. He made the enemy think that there were more of him than there actually was. And he was not going to give up an inch as long as his fellow soldiers lay wounded nearby. Yes, he was scared, but he had a job to do, and he was not going to quit. I'll tell you a few more stories that really struck with the impressionable young me. Leonard Burchell, lest I be accused of being too Army-centric. Leonard Burchell, one of the very few pilots in the Royal Canadian Air Force at the outbreak of the Second World War. Birch, as he was often called, held the distinction of capturing the first Italians of the Second World War. Strange circumstances. Hours after Canada declared war on Italy, he spotted an Italian freighter in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So he immediately didn't actually expend any weapons, but he started doing fake dive bombing attacks on the ship. And this so concerned the skipper of the vessel that I guess he lost sense of what he was doing and accidentally ran the ship aground, which made it real easy to capture, and everyone was marched off and held in prisoner of war camps until the end of the war. 2 years later, he was flying a Catalina flying boat out of Sri Lanka, at the time known as Ceylon, and he spotted the Japanese fleet on its way to attack the island. He spotted the fleet, the same one that had attacked Pearl Harbor 4 months earlier, reported it, and thus foiled the attack. He'll be forever remembered in that part of the world as the savior of Ceylon. This was a tremendous service, but it did him little good in the moment. In the course of his mission, the Japanese fleet shot him down and captured him and his surviving crew. For Burchell, the war was over, but his story was just beginning. Burchell endured 3 years and 4 months in some of the most difficult conditions imaginable. Japanese prisoner of war camps were among the most nightmarish of conditions: disease, starvation, and violence. But Burchell did not merely endure, he led. He ensured that food was shared and that the sickest got the most nutrient-dense rations available. He organized sit-down strikes to get the most leverage with the guards. He refused special favors, which as a senior officer in the camp he was entitled to, and he put himself in harm's way. For instance, if a soldier was going to be beaten by a guard, he would physically place himself in the way. Sometimes that meant that he got the beating. He set the highest standard possible, and people believed in him, and they followed his example. It was contagious. I asked him how could he do this? One day, sure, okay, but day after day, week after week, no idea how long the war would last. But he was perfectly clear. He was a leader. That was his job. If he lost hope, everyone would lose hope. And perhaps most tellingly, he said that he knew the guards wouldn't beat him as badly as they would beat his soldiers. So on the whole, if he took the beating, his team would suffer less. That's an incredible calculus to accept. That it is better for me to be beaten here in this moment than for my team to suffer more than it must. This was amazing to me, the amount of pain, discomfort, and fear this man could endure in the cause of his team. Mostly people he didn't even know before that point, was just so far beyond anything I saw as being humanly possible. Now, one more story. Frank Moritsuku, a young man in British Columbia at the time, he was born in Canada. Both parents were Japanese Canadian. And for that, he was among the 22,000 Japanese Canadians forcibly relocated into the British Columbia interior. His family lost much of the They lost their home, they lost all the items that they had worked very hard to acquire over the years, and they didn't get much of it back, or they got pennies on the dollar when all was said and done. But later in the war, he was released, and he could have done just about anything he wanted to, but what did he do? He joined the Canadian Army. He joined the Canadian Intelligence Corps specifically, and was among the Japanese Canadians who were sent to Burma to assist the British land forces fighting there. He was not sitting comfortably behind the lines translating documents either. He was sent to the front lines, and when they were assaulting a position, he was the person on the megaphone trying to convince the Japanese soldiers to surrender. Not surprisingly, the Japanese speaker behind a megaphone was basically a bullet magnet in this situation. So he put himself at great risk. Frank's stories were very striking for me. Why, I asked him, would you do that? Why weren't you angry? Why weren't you bitter? Why would you want to serve a country that did not trust you or want you around? And his answer stopped me in my tracks, and I've reflected on a great deal in the years since. He said, because Canada at its worst was still better than so many other countries at their best. Canada at its worst is still better than so many countries at their best. Wow. Now, obviously, this is one man's opinion, one man's perspective, and maybe he's changed it over the course of his life. I don't know. Certainly, it does not excuse any errors, past, present, or future, but I've always carried it with me. It also shaped how I think about what Canada is, and that it is a Canadian project of sorts that evolves and changes, which means that the wrongs of the past don't have to define who we are today. That admitting to errors of the past does not in any way diminish what we are or what we can become. We can know our history and move forward and know that within this messy business we call history, there's something truly great about Canada and that it is worth defending. Now remember, the whole reason I did this oral history project in the first place was to get that extra credit so that I could go to France and go on my little student exchange, the high school student. I got an A, if you were wondering. I did get those credits, I did go to France. And in early September 2001, I arrived in Lille in northern France, very excited for this opportunity to study abroad. But my excitement quickly tanked. About a week after arriving in Lille, the 9/11 attacks happened. Now, it has recently been brought to my attention that in any given audience today, there are not only people who are not old enough to remember September 11th, but in fact are old enough to join the army and drink, who were born after September 11th. So just a few words on what it was like. This is an actual thing I've had to explain to troops under my command. We were scared and confused, and we did not know what was going to happen next. And it was a real wake-up call about how big and complicated and inhospitable the world could be. Soon, for the first time since the Korean War, there were Canadians engaged in combat operations in Afghanistan. First the Special Forces, and soon the 3rd Battalion of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. They arrived in southern Afghanistan, along with gunners and armored reconnaissance soldiers. I reflected on what those soldiers were doing in Afghanistan and what I had learned from the veterans I had interviewed. Their sense of selfless service, the idea that Canada was not perfect, but that was not the point. It could be better, and anyone could contribute to that. Their pride in service, the idea that one could be trained to be better than they were, to serve Canada and protect those they cared about. And now here was this war. How could I do anything but sign up? So of course, that's what I did. I entered the Royal Military College of Canada, and 4 years later, I was commissioned as an officer in the 3rd Battalion of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, leading some of the very soldiers I'd seen on TV 4 years earlier. Many of them had returned to Afghanistan in the intervening period as part of the Provincial Reconstruction Team in 2005, and now we watched together on TV as the 1st Battalion entered a new phase of the war, a newer, more violent phase, in the summer of 2006. At the 3rd Battalion, we did hard, interesting training, parachuting, climbing mountains, urban operations, close quarter combat, but also bringing new people into the battalion and getting them the skills that they needed. One of my favorite experiences was running 4 months of training with my senior non-commissioned officers for a batch of new troops, and then immediately taking them on an advanced mountain warfare exercise in the Rocky Mountains. And it was wonderful. Junior people that we had spent so long training, they stepped up into leadership roles, and they did an incredible job. and some of them have gone on to skyrocket through the ranks or join the special forces, sniper, or close protection organizations. They're amazing, and just thinking about that time with those soldiers puts a smile on my face. Alas, these were not the soldiers with which I would deploy in 2008, because the rapidly changing mission in Afghanistan had evolved yet again. There was a new focus on training the Afghan National Army such that it could conduct the necessary operations to secure their country. Almost overnight, the Canadian commitment shifted from mentoring one battalion of the Afghan National Army to mentoring an entire brigade. And that meant more mentors fast. Before I really knew what was going on, without the usual several months of very specific workup training that usually comes with this sort of thing, I was on my way to Afghanistan and was assigned to a reconnaissance company to mentor. I had a small team of Canadian troops. I had never met them before, and soon we were embedded with the company on the western boundary of Kandahar province. I should highlight that at this stage in my career, I was probably a decent platoon commander with almost no knowledge of what was going on at the company level, but the expectation was I would learn on the job. My team was cobbled together from different parts of the Canadian organization. We didn't know each other, as I said, and we hadn't done any training together. We had people from the military police, the national support element, and the battle group. We had a LAV-3 light armored vehicle with a 25mm chain gun on top and an RG-31 Nyala, basically a big, heavy armored truck with a C6 general purpose machine gun on top. But the most important weapons we had were the brains, personalities, and fighting spirit of Canadian soldiers. Hardworking, smart, dedicated, aggressive, but also patient and compassionate. A lot of mentorship is spending time together, training, playing games, breaking bread, building trust and camaraderie despite the barriers of language and culture. And wow, were my soldiers able to deliver on that. They could seamlessly integrate into the Afghan unit. They figured out enough Dari and Pashto to get by and have some fun, and they made friends. So whenever there was downtime, my soldiers were often to be found playing volleyball with their counterparts, or learning these board games that the Kuchi nomads play with lines drawn in the sand and rocks. It's a whole thing. It's something to behold. Eating meals together, building trust and confidence in one another. This is how you build teams. This was fun and uplifting, but it was also extremely important for the mission. I did not command anyone in the Afghan National Army. I had to convince them to do the right thing. I had to persuade them to undertake a mission. I had to encourage them to train and to build capabilities that they didn't always want to develop, like using their own system for logistics support, instead of just asking us to give them what they needed at the last minute. Getting them to use their own logistics system, which was rife with problems, was often much more difficult than convincing them to go into harm's way. They were tremendously courageous. They didn't balk at going into harm's way. Our job was, after all, to make the Afghan National Army better suited to go into battle and to stand on their own 2 feet. This meant sharing the risk with them, often patrolling 2 or 3 times a day, sometimes long patrols, sometimes short, sometimes mounted, sometimes on your 2 feet. We did after-actions reviews after each operation and built training to get better, step by step. And they did get better, but often these were small victories. For instance, teaching a soldier how to sight machine guns and then watch him carefully, on his own initiative, find a great position to place the machine gun overlooking his unit as it moved through open terrain. Or another sergeant who did not know how to read a map when we started, did not have any thoughts at all about resupply, go on to plan an operation, watch them pull out their map, figure out a grid, pick up the radio, call in resupply, link up with resupply vehicles, and carry on with the mission. Bit by bit, small but incremental victories. Some of the Afghan troops loved patrolling so much that they enthusiastically volunteered to go out, and when you told them something in an after-action review, they really took it to heart. We had one soldier, we called him Abe, because I think he was the tallest person in Afghanistan, and he had Abraham Lincoln's exact nose. In an after-action review, I pointed out to him that he had done a very good job checking behind him every once in a while on patrol. So on the next patrol, he basically did the whole thing walking backwards. And I had to tell him great, Appreciate it. Nice to see you're listening to me, but tone it down a bit. Another soldier decided he was going to be my bodyguard, and he followed me around just like a bodyguard, checking every room I went into, standing me with everywhere I went. We talked a lot, him and I. His wife had recently given birth to a baby girl. He sent money home, but he was not sure if he could stay in the Army forever. The infantry soldiers on my team were absolutely essential for training and fighting. We were, after all, developing a light infantry force. But we also had signalers who kept us connected with the outside world, the most incredible medics who could patch up just about anything, a psychological operations detachment who helped us understand the human terrain, the locals, and an amazing team of interpreters. My interpreter was especially amazing. We did everything together, and he kept me well informed on cultural nuances. When he thought someone was being misleading or holding something back, or if there was a strange figure of speech, he was absolutely invaluable. And between his insight, the local knowledge of the Afghan National Army and our PSYOPs team, and the fact that we stayed in the same village the whole tour, we really had a very intimate knowledge of our community that we were part of. We had a good network of confidential informants, and people called in the location of improvised explosive devices, for instance. Most of the tips we received were true and accurate, although there were many as well that were clearly by the Taliban as bait, trying to lure us into traps. People still openly spoke to us on patrol, and we were well known as people, as individuals, like people you could talk to, and you liked this one more than that one, for instance. I was pretty accustomed to being called Taylor Khan or King Tyler, and I was invited to a few weddings. I always respectfully declined, although on one occasion I did swing by the reception. We were also assisted by the presence of 2 U.S. Army Special Forces teams working with Afghan commandos and 2 American police mentor teams working with the local Afghan National Civil Order Police. Believe it or not, us and these 2 other groups, we fell under completely different silos, completely different chains of command. We didn't formally know that we were operating in the same area, doing the same thing. We literally stumbled upon each other in the marketplace. And seeing an opportunity when one presented itself, we decided we were going to be friends. And I invited them to move into our forward operating base. I happened to own some real estate, they didn't, and we worked together the rest of the time there. So we now had this wonderful situation. Afghan police working with Afghan soldiers and special forces, with mentors who got along great with each other, to say nothing of all the resources that comes with working with special forces. Everything from an explosive sniffing dog to a portable mass spectrometer for testing materials we could capture on a raid, which becomes really important when you're looking into explosives and drugs. We happen to be in the heart of opium country. Now, what I've spoken about so far has mostly been the good stuff. Camaraderie, cooperation, fun, and progress. But of course, it was not all sunshine and rainbows. Getting into fights means sometimes you get sucker punched, and sometimes an even worse fighter than you will land a blow. We found a lot of improvised explosive devices, but sometimes they found us first. We preempted a lot of ambushes, but sometimes we did not. We lost a lot of our Afghan National Army friends, especially the engineers, who fearlessly tried to defuse these roadside bombs, and those losses somehow always hurt the most. I remember the first time that the Taliban directly attacked my team. It was in the late spring. Up to that point, things had been relatively quiet. It had just been improvised explosive device attacks, but we were getting into summer, what we called fighting season. We had a brief visit from an allied unit, whom I shall tactfully decline to name, which had briefly given us 100 extra combat troops in our area. But in listening to Taliban radio traffic, we knew that they did not think especially highly of these soldiers. The Taliban called them blackliners, meaning that they stuck to the roads and they never went very far from their camp. With them gone, the Taliban thought, now was the perfect time to attack our camp. So I came up with a plan with our American police mentor team leader, and we decided that the best thing to do to throw the Taliban off was to show up where they least expected. We would do a mounted patrol very early in the morning through the desert, So we appeared behind some of the suspected Taliban locations, just as most people were waking up. We needed to break the perception that we were the blackliners. We, the Canadians, Americans, and our Afghans, needed to show that we could go wherever we needed, whenever we wanted. I'm not sure exactly what I was expecting in terms of a reception, but I was not expecting to find 5 dug-in mortar baseplate positions. It was either a location meant to be defended at all costs, but based on some documents we subsequently captured, it was probably actually a training facility. Yes, the Taliban trained too. They were not prepared for our arrival, which was the plan, because their defense was not at all coordinated. Out of nowhere, as we're driving in, the first mortar round came in, and it landed near my lab. I was initially stunned because, of course, I had never been mortared before. But that moment of shock came and went, and the training kicked in. My gunner spotted the firing position, and he opened up with the chain gun as the enemy fired the second round. We maneuvered the vehicles to better firing positions, even as mortar crews from inside the position rushed to the base plates. With their locations now obvious, the gunners on the other vehicles did their jobs and eliminated these threats as they presented. It was a strange experience, and not the least. Each time, I was deeply impressed by the performance of our team. There were also other complications, shall we say, besides the Taliban themselves. Corruption was tragically rampant. On a few occasions, out on patrol, we caught were essentially robbers along the side of the road. They had rifles, they pull over a car, they take some money, take some stuff. Very run-of-the-mill criminality. So if we caught someone like that, we'd arrange to hand them over to the police, or we'd have the police take them in the first place, and we'd take them into custody and bring them down to the district center where I thought there would be something resembling a trial. Well, silly me. We would then bump into the same person in the market a little later, only to learn that they had paid a fine to the district leader. This was not a fine in any judicial meaning of the term. This was just a bribe. Because there were no judges in our district. None. And the police understandably did not want to take the risk of driving a prisoner on the dangerous roads all the way to Kandahar City, where they would likely deliver the prisoner to a different authority who would probably also just take a bribe. But it got worse. The district leader, who was eventually removed, was deeply involved in the poppy trade. He either owned the fields or he received tribute from the farmers to not interfere in the operations. And when they didn't, he abused his power. He went out with the police and burned their fields. At first glance, this seems normal, right? I mean, good riddance. We don't want those poppy fields there. We don't want poppy fields in Afghanistan. But there was a proper poppy eradication program. The difference was the official poppy eradication program had a system, checks and balances, and compensation for the farmers who lost what, for them, was their only means of income. This, what the district leader was doing, was just an abuse of power, and sometimes the farmers responded with deadly force. Fortunately, that district leader was replaced, and those police were among the first to be removed from the district to undergo intensive training. This was a program called Focused District Development, FDD, and these police were backfilled by the much more competent Afghan National Civil Order Police that I mentioned earlier. Now, I refused to play a role in these unsanctioned poppy eradication schemes. We were out on our own, so you had to make decisions and then check with your chain of command that you'd made the right one, and fortunately, it turned out I made the right one. But I also had no reasonable means of stopping or curtailing what the district leader was doing. He was, after all, the representative of the government of Afghanistan in the region. In fact, the only representative of the government in Afghanistan in the region. And he was using the police to do his dirty work. This drove a wedge between the Afghan people and the Afghan state. But it all got me thinking, why do we in Canada have reasonable trust in our elected officials? Why do we feel invested in the system? Why do we think most invoices will be paid most of the time, that most laws will be obeyed most of the time? I started to think about the law, the confidence people have in each other that they will follow most of the rules most of the time. And I was, at that point in time, working on one part of the problem. soldiering and training the state security apparatus, training their soldiers. But I didn't know what the rules were. What were the Afghan rules? Were they like our rules? They couldn't be. But I needed to know. If I was going to get the army to work with the police, I had to know what laws they were enforcing. I had to have a situation where the people trusted in these institutions, right? And once you start thinking about these things, it's very hard to stop. I started asking questions, and I probably got very annoying. I began asking to get some documents. What was codified and what wasn't? What elements of customary dispute resolutions did the Afghan government recognize, and which ones were not recognized? What was considered to be a matter of local concern, and what was centrally controlled from Kabul? These seem to be really important questions. Not important when you're in the middle of a gunfight, but important for the broader mission. I did not get all the answers I wanted while I was there. I asked the questions, and I learned a lot from the locals about their local conflict resolution mechanisms. These were the informal mechanisms of dispute resolution. The Pashtun people of southern Afghanistan actually have a very robust system in place for dealing with family disputes, the sharing of water, determining land boundaries, land that belongs to a private individual and land that is held in common. Now, the Taliban were deeply involved in this system. We were not. But as I learned more about the process, I found how deeply ingrained the Taliban shadow judiciary was in that district. They used recognized, acknowledged systems of dispute resolution with their very specific fundamentalist bent. It was not fair or equitable or in line with any of our Western concepts of human rights, but it was acknowledged as legitimate by the locals. The government of Afghanistan, in comparison, seemed to almost be a very thin layer of carpet laid on top of an old, sturdy hardwood floor. Because in this situation, who was really solving the locals' problems? One day on a supply run to Kandahar airfield, I was asking my annoying questions again. I think on that day I was trying to get a copy of a translated Afghan criminal code, still haven't gotten one. An exasperator staff officer blurted out at me, "Well, if you're so interested in this stuff, why don't you go to law school?" So I did. I spent more time in the regular force training people to be mentors for the Afghan National Security Forces, but when that mission ended, I applied to law school. I moved to Toronto, started my studies here, and stuck with the reserves, joining the 48th Highlanders. I'm still studying this topic. I am fascinated by the concept of the state's monopoly on the legitimate use of violence, which has brought me to perhaps an unhealthy obsession with the subject of foreign fighters, with legal pluralism, how one legal system can exist with or within another, how states try to weaponize law and legal arguments, such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine, clearly unlawful, but even Putin wants to cloak it in some kind of harebrained legal argument. And my biggest project right now is on the evolution of the rule of law in Canada, the slow, torturous process by which the military was removed from public order interventions in the 19th century, where it happened very frequently, to today, where it is blessedly rare. I'm truly blessed to get to explore these topics in my studies, but also share them with my students at the Canadian Forces College. Many of you know that at the Canadian Forces College, we run the Joint Command and Staff Program and the National Security Program, full-year programs to educate our Canadian Armed Forces leaders, to better prepare them for the challenges that lie ahead for these senior leaders in an increasingly unstable world. It is truly an honor to work with this dynamic student body, learn from them and their experiences, and I hope I teach them a thing or two along the way too. So that's me. That's a bit about my journey, how I came to be where I am today. I've left out a lot, of course, but hopefully it gives you a sense of me. I don't know if there are many lessons to draw out of it, but maybe I'll try highlighting a few things. First, it's that our shared history is complicated and sometimes ugly. I know that I was part of things in Afghanistan that will invite criticism, and I welcome it. I am comfortable with the concept that history is messy, and I invite the scrutiny that helps us grow and get better. History can inspire us, but it should inspire us to be the best version of ourselves, not to chase some idyllic point in time that never really existed. Second, wherever you are, whatever you do, acknowledge the people that got you there. I've mentioned my father, and I'll mention Mr. Kevin Murphy, my high school history teacher, who had a deep impact on my life. I hope I've left with you the sense that as a leader, you exceed and fail based on the people you work with and who work for you. And I've been blessed to work with some of the most inspiring soldiers imaginable. I'm not mentioning their names specifically out of a sense of privacy and respect for that. And when you have the chance to help these people in return, this is the highest honor. For instance, I'm truly happy to say that my wonderful interpreter in Afghanistan is now in Canada, a proud Canadian, along with his wife, and we, Canada, are so lucky to have him here. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thanks, Tyler. Stay up here, will you? If you have any comments or questions, Tyler can take those. Yes?
I'll on first, David.
Go ahead, Tyler.
Sorry. I was going to ask you the last thing you said. Did your interpreter make it out? So thank you for saying that thing.
He did.
Actually, go ahead.
And David Burnett here, from Toronto. You must not be a fan of revisionist history. How do you deal today with those who love revisionist history?
I hate the concept of revisionist history because all history should be revisionist in some sense. Like good history looks at the best sources. Good history looks at the world as the people who lived it understood it. So as we uncover new sources, as we look at things from different perspectives, it's always going to be revised. There's always going to be new and better stuff. The issue I have is when that process is perhaps not respected and history is weaponized, history is extracted from its context and transmogrified to prove a given point. I won't give any specific examples of that, but that is what I take issue with. If you're trying to push some sort of political or ideological agenda, you determine what you want to prove, and then you backtrack to find evidence to support that. That's the bad kind of revisionist history. The good kind of revisionist history, which I like to just call history, is a constant re-examination and challenging of what we think we know. I just spent a few weeks in Manitoba going through Louis Riel's papers, and it has completely changed what I thought I knew about the man. It has completely changed what I think a lot of people think they know about the provisional government. So some might look at that and say, that's revisionist history, you're rewriting it. No, I went and I looked at documents that the last guy didn't look at. And that's the good way, I think.
Another question. It's an easy one. How old are you? And how many hours are in one of your days?
That's very kind. I'm 38.
Okay. It's a very humbling story.
Any other questions or comments? Can't be that one. How old am I? Yeah, right. Thank you, Tyler. I'd like to ask Lieutenant Colonel Mike Clary, First Vice President of RCMI, to come up with comments of appreciation and to give a little gift.
Tyler, you covered a number of different areas. So first of all, thank you very much for the story of your development, your life, which I think is very interesting and informative. Thank you for your accounts of Afghanistan, because every time I hear somebody's first-hand accounts of Afghanistan, I learn a little more about the complexity of the situation that we and so many other countries were trying to deal with. And thank you for the historical vignettes that you gave at the beginning of your speech, because those accounts of heroism and dedication and application of training and your own accounts give an excellent perspective of Canada and what it is to be Canadian and what we still have to work for. So in thanks from the Institute You're getting one of our world-renowned medallions in great appreciation
Thank you very much.
for your speech. Thank
For the
you.
camera, gentlemen. Hold up the medal. Hold up the nice medal. Open it up.
So that get the flash off the medal.
It's very expensive.
Yes, I know. And you know, novices, heavens. There we go.
Thank you so much.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now and thank you for joining us.